What are the significant threats right now? I do want to talk to you about this bank secrecy stuff, but just before we get into that, where are the significant regulatory threats right now? What are you worried about? Or focused on?
So, like I said, if we were talking 4 or 5 years ago, we'd be sort of forced to talk about securities law a lot and about how like the SEC's overbroad interpretation of what is a security means they get too many prudential and permission-based regulatory controls over the space. And I always had trouble with that because there were definitely tokens sold in the crypto space that probably were securities and probably would have benefited from more disclosures from the issuers, right? What's changed and what makes things a lot more high stakes now is that regulators and lawmakers are not just coming for the scams anymore. They're not just trying to clean up our space, which I'd frankly welcome. They're now trying to like impose fairly aggressive permission-based regulations on the core infrastructure providers themselves. And so maybe just a couple examples. Senators Warren and Marshall, a Republican, have a bill that would classify miners, node operators. It even has terms like MEV searchers and software developers of unhosted or self-hosted wallets, all as Bank Secrecy Act regulated, which means they're not allowed to do the things they do, whether it's publish software or mine new blocks, without knowing the name and address, the identification of all the people putting transactions in that block, or all the people using that self-hosted wallet to hold their own Bitcoin.
Which is impossible.
That's not only, it's impossible, right? Yeah. So it's not only probably unconstitutional because we have certain rights to privacy in this country, and forcing people to spy on other people just because they use their software or just because their transactions in their block is probably unconstitutional. It's also impossible. Like you said, it would grind these networks to a halt. So that's a big one. And then another example that we can talk about more is the Tornado Cash sanction. So, you know, I know your audience is more Bitcoin oriented, but
they care about this one.
Yeah, and I think that's right, because it also has implications for things like Wasabi Wallet or CoinJoin transactions generally in the Bitcoin space. You know, there are some mixers out there that are custodial, and so it's reasonable to regulate them like you regulate Coinbase because they're custodial, right? Coinbase, in a certain sense, is a mixer. The money all goes in an omnibus wallet, it comes out. So it's fair to treat them as a regulated entity and to have them do some level of financial surveillance to prevent illicit funds moving through their wallets. Tornado Cash, you know, say what you will about the things that were sort of adjacent to it, like the Torn token and some other stuff that frustrates me. The core contracts that did the privacy function were immutable smart contracts on the Ethereum blockchain. Well, Bitcoin audience, as immutable as any smart contract on the Ethereum blockchain is. But you know, there was no day-to-day control over any of the funds in that pool, and the privacy that you got out of it was quite good compared to, you know, using Ethereum generally. So if an American wants to use that for our own privacy, and they don't end up paying anyone in North Korea by using it because they don't, and they don't end up paying the developers by using it because they don't, why can't we use that smart contract? And I've sort of failed to set it up adequately if you haven't been following Tornado Cash, but the long and short of it is OFAC, a wing of the US Department of Treasury, came in and said, Americans can't use this smart contract anymore because it's the property of a sanctioned entity, which is nonsense, because a smart contract that no one can edit is not the property of anyone, any more than the Bitcoin protocol writ large is the property of Satoshi. And telling Americans they can't use it for their own private purposes is deeply anti-liberty and also obviously really bad for the technology. So we're suing. That's one of our 2 lawsuits, is to say that they can't identify the smart contract itself as something Americans can't interact with.
Right. Okay. In terms of this self-hosted wallet term, one I hate.
I know. I hate it too.
Yeah, but the fact that they're using it, I keep thinking about it. It's like, I have a wallet with my credit cards and my cash. It feels like they're essentially trying to regulate the same thing as that. It's like saying your wallet in your pocket, we're going to regulate that.
Yeah, I mean, and it's funny, the self-hosted wallet term is actually the slightly improved term that we sort of kind of tried to drag them towards, because they used to say unhosted. It's either a hosted wallet, which sounds good. It's like, a Christmas host, or it's unhosted. It's just like hanging out there in the wilderness.
In the wild, partying.
The party. So Yes, that's the correct metaphor. It's just hard to get people to understand that, right? Like a
Yeah.
scrap of leather that you hold your dollars or your credit cards in. It would be absurd to say that scrap of leather is a financial institution, just like J.P. Morgan or Bank of America. And so that scrap of leather and whoever makes it and advertises it and puts it out in the world needs to identify the people who are putting dollars in it. It's absurd. I mean, to give a little bit of sort of fairness, because that metaphor is a strong metaphor. I think it's the right metaphor. The fact of the matter is, like, if you're using a wallet that is on the Android Play Store or the Apple App Store, the developers of that wallet can regularly push updates. And at one point, they could push an update that actually, has a bug in it, or is even malicious and steals people's crypto, right?
Yeah.
So there's a level of trust here that's maybe a little bit stronger than just the guy who stitches this together, like a leather wallet, or a safe manufacturer. Although the metaphor's still right. You're just buying maybe a slightly defective safe. That doesn't mean we'd regulate safe manufacturers as banks and say you need a camera in your safe that you sell, that so every time your user opens it, they see their face and then report that to the government. And there are ways to get at issues like bugs in software or even malicious software that don't involve having like wall-to-wall surveillance over people's usage of the software. You would say, no, it's subject to the FTC's unfair deceptive acts and practices law, which doesn't mean that the software developer, like if it's Bitcoin Core, needs to come into the FTC and say, do we have permission to publish this? Not at all. There's no permission involved. It just says, oh, if you publish it and it actually stole people's money, then the FTC can sue the developers of that software in order to protect the users of that software. So that's a reasonable regime for protecting users of software, even in an environment where software can often be buggy and even malicious. This notion that we would, however, say that that's not enough. What we need is true, like wall-to-wall surveillance of people's own use of their own software or of someone else's software, is much more akin to like the encryption debates that we had in the 90s, where it was like, we can't have strong encryption out there. All encryption needs to have a little back door so that law enforcement can decrypt any ciphertext whenever they want because of terrorism or because of financial crime or a number of other things. And that's a debate, I guess. But in the encryption context, it's obvious how that's just not going to work out well, because backdoor keys get lost and the wrong people end up with them. Or even if it's just the right people, quote unquote, that have them, if it's the governments become corrupt, governments become tyrannical.
Yeah.
And there's a very important American, but also Anglo-Saxon and maybe just global notion that the citizen should reserve certain rights for themselves and have some ability to defend themselves against an oppressive sovereign. And if you tell people they can't have strong encryption, you're disarming them in a certain way.
Yeah. Well, they took it here. I don't know if you've followed what happened here, but enter encryption is essentially been banned here in the UK.
Really? I haven't been following.
Yeah, it's the online safety bill. I need to follow go and check the details, but I'm pretty sure it's entering encryption has been bad because they want to protect children from pedophiles and they want to stop people transferring images across networks, which is a noble cause, but
of course,
but is a, for want of a better word, a backdoor way of dealing with a problem they're not going to stop. But it does mean that we've kind of lost end-to-end encryption here. I think Signal said they're moving out of the market. So, yeah.
That's crazy. Yeah.
I mean, but we don't have a constitution.
I was going to say this goes back to... So, I mean, a lot of our American legal traditions come from the UK, and a lot of really important rights and notions of property and tort come from the Anglo-Saxon common law. But when you don't have a written constitution, because you've got this rich unwritten constitution in the UK. When you have a written constitution to sort of reason about, things can maybe go off the rails a little bit more easily. Anyway, not to get into a comparative constitutional law discussion, but
we actually, I should correct, because someone will email me and they'll be saying, well, no, we have the Magna Carta, but it's not something anyone I know has read or cares about, and it's not like we have something like, well, we must protect my First Amendment rights or Fourth Amendment rights. Like, we're not like that in the UK. We just take a beating every now and again, accept everything. All right, the king said so.